Hey everyone, it's Jeff Young, kinesiologist, and this video is on aerobic program design for general and special populations. With the exception of high intensity interval training and sprint interval training, which I'll cover in another video, this one covers just about everything you'd ever want to know, so let's jump right into it. All right, so we'll go over this FITT-P principle for aerobic program design. It's a really simple way to design an aerobic program. You can also use it for flexibility and trigger point program design, where the F stands for frequency, the I stands for intensity, the first T stands for time or duration, second T stands for type, and the P stands for progression. So when you fill in these blanks, you've just created a program for yourself, and it's really simple with the exception of intensity needs to be explained in some more detail, which I'll do in another picture with a couple charts and graphs. And the time or duration of aerobic exercise is so case by case and dependent a lot on the individual's fitness level and the goal for the session and the type of exercise. But I'm only going to briefly go over it in this presentation and may create another presentation to go over it in a lot more detail. So starting with frequency, and really just for the most part reading off what I have in the little box there. You obviously can do it either as little as 1 day a week or as many as 7 days a week, although I wouldn't recommend 7, just because it's always good to give the body 1 or 2 days of rest. And time and desire are common factors which determine the frequency of aerobic exercise training. The governing body guidelines from the American College of Sports Medicine, American Heart Association recommend 150 to 300 minutes per week of aerobic exercise of moderate intensity, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity, or some sort of combination of each. But the truth is, for general and special populations, what typically determines frequency is the time they have in the course of their week and their schedule and the desire that they have. And especially with special populations, I don't begin by letting them know what these guidelines are, because I'd rather just in the initial consultation find out from them how much time they can dedicate per week to exercise. I always have it in my mind that since resistance training is the biggest bang for your buck form of exercise, that we're going to try to prioritize that. And then once we get that figured out, then I'll determine how I'm going to insert aerobic exercise within the scope of the frequency that they can give per week. Or in other words, can we set up aerobic exercise on days where they are not resistance training, or do we need to combine the two? And then lastly, as it says in the last sentence in that box, when the goals pertain to weight loss or improvements in aerobic capacity, increasing frequency is indicated, which just means that you're going to want to increase frequency to reach those goals. So now on the subject of intensity, there's 2 types of intensity, objective and subjective. With objective intensity, you're just measuring your heart rate in beats per minute. And the easiest way to do that is with the use of a heart rate monitor. And I highly suggest to my clients that they purchase and use heart rate monitors, even though for general and special populations, the use of RPE scales and the talk test, which I'm going to go over in some detail, is more important. You still want to combine the 2 methods, because you want to be able to see where your heart rate is and how it corresponds with how you feel you're exerting, or how you feel your level of fatigue is in the moment, and your rate of breathing or ventilation. But having said that, recent evidence or critical reviews have questioned the use of measuring heart rate or measuring percent of VO2 max as the primary way to looking at intensity, because this type of measurement and way to determine the aerobic training zone isn't as accurate as they once thought. It's no longer considered the gold standard, partially because there's too much variation from individual to individual, across genders and across the age span, and partially because there's subjectivity with the equations that are being used and or the field tests being used to determine aerobic capacity and therefore the parameters of the aerobic training zone. So this is not to say that measuring heart rate in beats per minute while you're performing aerobic exercise is a waste of time. You still want to see where it's at so you can get an idea of how it corresponds with your breathing and your rate of perceived exertion, it's just to say don't use heart rate as your primary form of measuring intensity. Moving on to the first T, which is time or duration. This can really vary a lot. It can be anywhere from as little as 5 minutes if someone is really deconditioned, for example, to as much as 2 or 3 hours for endurance athletes and ultra endurance athletes. And another thing that determines the time or duration of aerobic exercise within the scope of a session is the intensity that you're exercising at, because the lower the intensity, the longer you can perform aerobic exercise because of the lack of fatigue. And as intensity increases, the ability to sustain it decreases, which is going to shorten the length of time that you can perform it. So with that said, let's talk a little bit more about subjective intensity. And first I want to draw your attention to the left side of the chart, where I created a chart that's titled RPE or RPF combined with talk test or ventilation rate. So the reason why I have RPE or RPF is because RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion, or the perceived effort that the individual thinks that they're putting into the exercise. But I like to think of it in the form of rate of perceived fatigue, mainly because my clients seem to relate to that better. It makes more sense to them to think about how much fatigue they're feeling in the moment than it does to think about how much effort they feel like they're putting into it. So with that said, if you look at the bottom of the chart, a 1 RPE or RPF, whichever one you prefer to use, is very light activity, or it's anything that's just above the intensity of sleeping or sitting quietly. So in other words, you don't feel like you're doing much of anything. A 2 or 3 would probably equate to a slow to moderate walk for most people, or in the example of someone being on an elliptical, it would just be at an intensity where they feel like they could continue it for hours and they really don't feel a change in their breathing either. They could easily converse with you. But as you begin to move up in intensity and move up the totem pole, once you get to a 4 RPE or RPF, you've now reached the low end of your aerobic training zone. And the primary way to know that you're at a 4 is that your ventilation or your breathing has begun to change. And there's 2 ways your breathing can change. You can either begin to breathe more deeply or at a faster rate. And the first thing that happens when you hit the low end of your training zone is that you start to notice that your breathing is getting deeper. And then if you continue to pick up the intensity, the depth of your breathing will not only begin to increase, but you also start to notice that the rate of your breathing increases as well. So that once you get up to about a 6 or a 7 on an RPE scale, the exercise is beginning to feel uncomfortable. If someone were to ask you how long you can sustain it, you probably would be able to take an educated guess that it'd be in the 10 to 30 minute range, because you're definitely starting to feel some fatigue building up in your leg muscles. The breathing is now moderately heavy, and it's not so easy to hold a conversation anymore. If someone were speaking with you, you'd only be able to respond back to them in short sentences. So now moving over to the right side of this picture and the blue arrow chart that I created. It's pretty much saying the same thing, but it gives just a little bit more information. The left side of the arrow before the letters, or the letters and the numbers, LT1, is when you're exercising at an intensity where your breathing hasn't changed yet. And what LT1 means, and I could also have put VT1, is your first lactate or ventilatory threshold, which once again means that you've hit the low end of your training zone and that you've noticed your breathing is starting to change. And what's happening physiologically is that your body is beginning to increase its reliance on carbohydrates as an energy source. And what that does is it increases the lactate production in your circulatory system, and it forces you to have to breathe a little bit heavier so that the clearance of the lactate is in equilibrium with its production. And then as you increase in intensity, which depending on the mode of exercise could include increasing the speed, or in the case of an elliptical, it could be the speed and the intensity of the pedaling. The same would go with a stationary bike in a gym, or even on a bicycle and using a higher gear. But the point is that as you increase intensity and start heading towards your second lactate threshold or ventilatory threshold, and you're moving higher within your aerobic training zone, the body begins to rely on carbohydrates more and more as an energy source. It decreases its reliance on fat as an energy source. Because of that, lactate production continues to increase, and it forces your body to have to breathe more deeply and at a faster rate in order to clear that lactate out. The four most common types of aerobic exercise are LSD. Yes, it's actually a real acronym, and it stands for long slow duration or long slow distance, which is what most people are doing when they perform aerobic exercise. And that just means that you're in the low to moderate end of your aerobic training zone, where you notice that change in your breathing, but it's not so difficult that you can't hold a conversation, and where you can sustain the duration typically for anywhere from 15 or 20 minutes upwards to about an hour. Another common type of aerobic exercise, especially for endurance athletes, is called tempo training, where you're at or just below your second lactate or ventilatory threshold, which corresponds with as high as the individual can exercise aerobically, and once again where they can only sustain it for about 10 to 20 or maybe 30 minutes for your higher level endurance athletes. And then once you've crossed LT2, you're no longer exercising aerobically. You've now entered the anaerobic zone. This corresponds with being at about a 7.5 to a 10 on an RPE scale. Breathing is very heavy and conversation is difficult, and it corresponds with high intensity interval training or sprint interval training, which is outside of the scope of this presentation. I'll be doing a separate presentation on those two types of training and the program designed for those two types of training. So that pretty much covers what you need to know for intensity. What's left is type and progression. When it comes to type, the main thing to know is that it falls into one of two categories. There's impact or non-impact. Impact just means that your joints are being impacted, such as in jogging or running or sprinting. And non-impact means that your joints are not being impacted, such as with an elliptical machine, swimming, or cycling. And the general recommendation is to alternate between the two because it's good to put stress on your joints to force them to have to adapt to the stress and get stronger. But at the same time, too much of anything is not good. So you want to sometimes give your joints a break by inserting non-impact exercise into your overall program. And it's really up to the individual and or the coach as to what the ratio should be. It doesn't necessarily need to be a 1-to-1 ratio where you just switch back and forth all the time. For instance, you could insert cycling or the elliptical machine once for every 3 times that you go out for a jog. And then lastly, when it comes to progression, this can occur by increasing frequency, duration, and or the intensity of exercise, and is also at the coach's or individual's discretion. But when it comes to frequency, keep in mind that while you can progress by increasing the frequency, since there's only 7 days in a week, you can only increase frequency so much. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, unless you're an endurance athlete who's preparing for some sort of competition, within the scope of a year, you really don't want to keep up frequency where it's always 5 or 6 days a week. You at least want to have some periods or phases where you decrease your frequency to 2, 3, or 4 times a week just to give your body and your mind a break. So because of that, the primary ways to progress are to progress in duration and or the intensity of exercise. And once again, there's an inverse relationship between the two. So as you progress in intensity, you may need to decrease your duration. Or as you progress in duration, your intensity is going to have to correspond. And then even though I'm saving high intensity and sprint interval training for another presentation, as far as going into more detail about program design, I do want to at least mention, as it says at the bottom of that last block, that it's critical for people and for trainers to understand that you don't want to put somebody on a high intensity or sprint interval training program until they've shown that they can comfortably sustain at least 20 minutes of continuous aerobic exercise at a moderate intensity, or in other words, about the middle of their aerobic training zone. So in conclusion, You want to determine your frequency within the scope of each week and use that as your start point, with the goal of trying to reach a minimum of 150 minutes per week of exercise in the low to moderate part of your heart rate training zone. If your goal is to lose weight, you may need to increase frequency to 4 to 6 times per week. I highly recommend purchasing a heart rate monitor so that you can see where your heart rate lies at different intensities. But use the RPE or RPF scale as your primary guide to determining your initial start point, as well as to guide progression. And keep in mind that to increase the accuracy of the RPE scale, you need to correspond the number that you think you're at, such as a 4 or 5 on a 1 to 10 scale, with the associated breathing rate. For general fitness, rotate between impact, such as walking or jogging, with non-impact, such as cycling or the elliptical machine, so that sometimes you're impacting your joints and sometimes you're giving them a break. If you suffer from disease or are deconditioned, start low, such as a 3 on a 1 to 10 scale, and then progress in small tolerable increments. And make sure you don't insert high-intensity interval training into your program until you can sustain at least 20 minutes of continuous exercise. So that's all for this instructional video. I hope you found it informative, and I'll see you in the next one.